Germany 1919. A proud empire shattered its people, drowning in worthless money and broken promises. Yet within just 20 years, this bankrupt nation would rise from the ashes to build highways that awed the world, field an army feared across Europe, and ignite the deadliest war in history. How did a country on the brink of collapse transform itself into a seemingly unstoppable superpower? And why was its dazzling economic miracle built on lies? The chill of a late autumn wind swept through Munich's narrow streets as ordinary citizens shuffled past shuttered shops and half-empty markets. To an unsuspecting traveler, the city might have looked like any other European capital recovering from the scars of the Great War. But the tension in the air betrayed a deeper unease. From beer halls to back alley cafes, whispers of unrest mingled with the smoke of cheap tobacco. On this particular day, the cobblestones echoed with the heavy boots of thousands of brown shirts armed radicals, whose very presence made families draw their curtains and bolt their doors. Germany in the early 1920s was a nation adrift, struggling to find its footing after the devastation of World War I. The proud empire that once dreamed of continental dominance was now fractured and humiliated. Inflation had become a silent predator, devouring the savings of every household. Prices doubled not over years or months, but within hours. Shopkeepers scrawled new numbers on their blackboards morning and night, as if chasing a phantom they could never catch. A single loaf of bread might cost a few marks at dawn, and a wheelbarrow full by dusk. Men and women who had once lived comfortably now carried stacks of near-worthless banknotes in burlap sacks, hoping to buy a meal before the currency collapsed again. The brown shirts, formerly known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, thrived in this chaos. Clad in their distinctive brown uniforms, they marched with a mixture of military precision and mob menace, promising order amid the storm. To many onlookers, they seemed like a new army rising from the ashes of defeat. But to those who dared look closer, they were a symptom of a nation's desperation. Their chants reverberated through the city, a thunderous reminder that the Great War had not truly ended in the minds of countless Germans. Yet Munich's unrest was only a microcosm of a broader national crisis. Across the country, families pawned heirlooms for scraps of food. Factories lay silent, their smokestacks cold and lifeless. Children wore shoes patched so many times they barely held together. What had begun as economic hardship was hardening into a collective bitterness, a feeling that the proud German people had been betrayed both by their enemies and by their own leaders. That bitterness was a tinderbox, and the spark that would ignite it was already smoldering in the hearts of radical movements. It is easy a century later to underestimate the sense of disorientation that gripped everyday Germans. They were not merely enduring financial strain, they were watching the foundations of their identity crumble. The empire that had defined their parents' generation was gone. The monarchy had vanished almost overnight. The marks in their pockets, once a symbol of industrial might, had become little more than colored paper. Even the calendar seemed unstable. Every day threatened a new upheaval. It was a collective freefall with no clear end. And yet, amid the despair, a dangerous idea began to take root, that Germany's humiliation was not merely the result of war or economic mismanagement, but of betrayal by foreign powers, by political moderates, by scapegoats carefully chosen by agitators who sensed the public's hunger for someone to blame. The brown shirt's presence in Munich was not just an ominous spectacle. It was the visible tip of a movement that promised a return to greatness at any cost. As night fell over the city, the sound of marching boots faded into the distance, but the unease remained. Germany stood at a crossroads. The Weimar Republic, fragile and untested, struggled to assert control while extremists gathered strength in the shadows. The nation's future, once filled with the promise of post-war peace, now teetered between fragile democracy and something far darker. Few could see it clearly then, but history was already tilting toward a path that would reshape not only Germany but the entire world. The chaos on Munich's streets was only the surface ripple of a much deeper break. To understand how Germany reached such desperation, we have to step back to the moment the empire itself crumbled. On November 11, 1918, the thunder of the Great War finally went silent. But for Germany, the armistice was not a relief, it was a wound. Soldiers who had fought for 4 brutal years marched home to find not victory parades, but confusion and scorn. In Berlin, the once mighty Kaiser Wilhelm II faced the country on the brink. Strikes erupted, sailors mutinied, and hunger gnawed at every class. Revolution flared across cities as weary citizens, exhausted by rationing and loss, demanded change. With little warning, Wilhelm fled into exile in the Netherlands, leaving the throne vacant and the empire leaderless. For a nation long defined by imperial hierarchy and Prussian discipline, the abdication felt like the floor dropping away beneath their feet. Into this vacuum stepped the Weimar Republic, a fragile experiment in democracy named for the quiet city where its constitution was drafted. Its leaders promised a modern representative government, but the republic's birth was anything but triumphant. Even as delegates debated new freedoms and civil rights, the shadow of Versailles loomed large. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed a burden that few Germans could accept. The treaty declared Germany solely responsible for the war and demanded reparations so staggering they seemed almost vindictive. Entire territories were stripped away. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, the Saarland placed under foreign administration, and colonies scattered across Africa and the Pacific seized by Allied powers. Worse still, the German army, once the pride of the nation, was reduced to a mere 100,000 men with no heavy artillery tanks or aircraft. For millions of citizens, these conditions were not just punitive, they felt like an intentional humiliation. Streets once decorated with imperial banners now echoed with bitter debate. In beer halls and backroom meetings, people whispered of a Dolchstoß, the stab-in-the-back myth that claimed civilian politicians, not soldiers, had betrayed the nation. This poisonous narrative spread quickly, suggesting that traitorous elite socialists and imagined enemies had sabotaged Germany from within. As the government struggled to pay its crushing reparations, resentment hardened. Taxes rose, industry faltered, and the mark began to weaken. Families who had sacrificed everything for the war effort felt abandoned, their patriotism answered with bankruptcy. Veterans returned to a society that seemed not only ungrateful but broken. Still, there were flickers of hope. The new republic introduced freedoms unimaginable under the Kaiser, expanded voting rights, vibrant political parties, and a constitution that aimed to protect civil liberties. Artists, writers, and intellectuals celebrated a modern cosmopolitan vision of Germany's future. Yet these early democratic promises were fragile seedlings in a field of scorched earth. Each parliamentary debate, each fragile coalition government was battered by the storms of public anger and economic collapse. By the early 1920s, it was clear that the Republic faced enemies on all sides. Monarchists longed for the return of the Kaiser. Communists dreamed of revolution in the mold of Soviet Russia. And nationalist paramilitaries, many composed of embittered ex-soldiers, prowled the streets in armed bands convinced that only force could restore German honor. In this volatile mix, the Weimar Republic stood like a house built on shifting sand. It represented a bold step toward democracy, but it carried the weight of war guilt and economic punishment that threatened to crush it before it could mature. Germany's fate, whether to rebuild as a peaceful modern nation or to slide back into authoritarianism, remained an open question, and the world watched uneasily. By the early 1920s, the economic pressures born of war reparations and political instability had become unbearable. Germany's leaders faced a seemingly impossible equation: astronomical debts from the Treaty of Versailles, a crippled industrial base, and a population already stretched to the breaking point. When the government hesitated on its reparation payments, France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's vital industrial heartland. In protest, German workers went on strike. Production screeched to a halt, yet the government still owed wages and reparations. Berlin's answer was to print more money, a decision that would haunt every German household. At first, the printing presses seemed to offer relief, but soon, the flood of new marks drowned the economy. Prices soared faster than shopkeepers could post them. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in 1921 cost hundreds by 1922, and by late 1923, the figure had leapt to billions and then trillions. The stories from this period defy belief. Children played with stacks of worthless banknotes like building blocks. Housewives carted wheelbarrows of cash to market, only to find the price had doubled by the time they arrived. Farmers who once sold milk to cities refused to trade for paper marks, insisting instead on barter coal for cheese shoes for potatoes. Middle-class families saw life savings evaporate overnight. Pensioners once secure were reduced to begging in the streets. The psychological toll was staggering. Respectable citizens, their futures obliterated, turned to black market dealings or theft just to survive. Inflation moved so fast that workers demanded to be paid twice a day, racing from factory gates to bakeries before their wages lost value. Newspapers printed daily editions listing exchange rates that shifted by the hour. Foreign visitors described Berlin as a city haunted by desperation and jittery energy, where cafes overflowed with people spending money as quickly as possible, knowing it would be worthless tomorrow. Amid the chaos, radical politics flourished. Both communist and nationalist factions promised order and salvation. Armed clashes erupted in city streets. Assassinations of government officials became grimly routine. To many Germans, the young Weimar Republic appeared fatally weak, unable to control its currency, its borders, or its destiny. Yet even in this abyss, a few visionaries sought solutions. Some economists proposed introducing a new currency tied to tangible assets like land or gold. Business leaders pleaded for foreign assistance, arguing that only an international plan could stabilize the mark and avert total collapse. But in 1923, with inflation at its peak, 4 trillion marks to a single US dollar, Germany seemed on the brink of complete social breakdown. The human suffering of this hyperinflationary spiral cannot be overstated. Families who had endured years of war now faced a new enemy, the vanishing value of their own money. Every day felt like a wager against time, with survival depending on sheer speed and luck. This collective trauma etched deep scars into the national psyche, scars that extremist movements would later exploit with deadly precision. Out of the wreckage of hyperinflation, Germany's leaders sought a lifeline, any strategy that could stabilize the currency and calm the chaos. International negotiators, alarmed that a collapsing Germany might destabilize all of Europe, stepped in. In 1924, the Dawes Plan emerged, named for American banker Charles G. Dawes, who spearheaded the effort to restructure German reparations. The plan's brilliance lay in its simplicity. First, it introduced a brand new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by empty promises, but by tangible assets, German land, and industrial goods. This gave the public something they could trust. Next, it reorganized the crushing reparation schedule, making payments more manageable and linking them to Germany's actual economic performance. Finally, American banks provided massive loans to jumpstart industry, and British diplomats lent their political weight to the agreement. Almost overnight, confidence began to return. Hyperinflation slowed, then stopped. Shops could finally post stable prices. Workers were paid in money that held value beyond a single afternoon. For the first time in years, Germans could save without fear of watching their wealth vanish in a day. The mid-1920s are sometimes called the Golden Twenties, and for good reason. Berlin blossomed into a hub of art, science, and innovation. Jazz clubs pulsed with energy. Filmmakers like Fritz Lang pioneered groundbreaking cinema. Writers and philosophers debated politics and modernity in smoky cafes. Women enjoyed new freedoms, entering universities and professions once closed to them. Modern architecture and Bauhaus design reflected a daring confidence that Germany could reinvent itself as a forward-looking democracy. Industry also surged. The Ruhr's factories hummed again, exporting steel and coal across Europe. Railways expanded, and foreign investment flowed into banks and manufacturing plants. Unemployment fell, and the middle class cautiously began to rebuild the savings they had lost. Yet beneath this apparent revival, cracks remained. Much of the new prosperity depended on foreign loans, especially from the United States. German cities borrowed eagerly to fund infrastructure, while private companies relied on American capital to expand. This infusion of money created a fragile bubble. If those loans were ever recalled, the system would wobble. Political tensions also simmered. Extremist groups had not disappeared. They merely waited for another opportunity. Still, for a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed as though the Weimar Republic might succeed. The Rentenmark was strong, and the Dawes Plan had bought time. Families picnicked in newly landscaped parks. Cafes brimmed with talk of literature and progress rather than starvation and despair. Across Europe, observers dared to hope that Germany might remain a peaceful, stable democracy. But history rarely grants easy reprieves. The nation's future prosperity was built on a delicate scaffolding of foreign confidence and short-term credit, one sudden shock away from collapse. And across the Atlantic, events were already gathering that would shake the world economy to its core and test Germany's fragile recovery like a cruel experiment. For a few bright years in the mid-1920s, it seemed as if Germany had escaped the gravity of its past. The Rentenmark held steady cafes in Berlin spilled with laughter, and the hum of industry promised a modern democratic future. But beneath that lively surface lay a dangerous dependency. The nation's recovery rested almost entirely on the lifeline of American credit. German factories, railroads, and even municipal governments borrowed heavily from U.S. banks, believing the stream of capital would never end. Then, in October 1929, Wall Street collapsed. The shock of the American stock market crash reverberated across the Atlantic like a sudden crack of thunder. Almost overnight, U.S. investors called in their loans and stopped new lending. The fragile scaffolding of the Weimar economy trembled and then began to crumble. Factories that had expanded on borrowed money suddenly faced empty order books. One after another, they shuttered their gates, laying off workers by the tens of thousands. Coal miners in the Ruhr watched their wages vanish as exports dried up. In Berlin, the neon lights of dance halls flickered out, while banks closed their doors. Within a year, industrial production fell by more than 40%. The human toll was swift and merciless. By early 1930, unemployment surged past 3 million. By 1932, it reached an estimated 6 million, nearly 1 in 3 employable Germans. Breadlines snaked through city streets as desperate men in threadbare coats waited for a ladle of thin soup. Families burned furniture to keep warm. Children scavenged scraps of coal from train yards. This collapse wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The sudden reversal from hopeful stability to desperate poverty shattered public faith in the Weimar government. Politicians argued endlessly in the Reichstag, while ordinary citizens grew bitter. Coalition after coalition fell apart, unable to agree on how to respond. The Republic's promise of democracy began to look like a cruel joke when parliamentary sessions dissolved into shouting matches and inaction. Into this vacuum of confidence surged fear, and with it the appeal of radical solutions. Communists promised a workers' revolution to sweep away capitalist corruption. Nationalists thundered about betrayal and humiliation, calling for a return to strength and unity. Paramilitary groups battled in the streets, their uniforms and flags visible symbols of competing futures. The brown shirts of the National Socialist movement grew especially bold, recruiting unemployed veterans and disillusioned youths with promises of purpose, discipline, and revenge. Propaganda sharpened old resentments. The stab-in-the-back myth that Germany had been betrayed by traitors at home rather than defeated in battle found new life. Anti-Semitic rhetoric, once confined to fringe voices, moved into mainstream conversation as demagogues blamed Jews for both capitalism's excesses and communist agitation. Each speech and street rally poured more fuel on the fire of despair. The political center, already fragile, began to disintegrate. Moderate parties lost votes as the extremes surged. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging war hero who served as a stabilizing figurehead, struggled to maintain order. Successive chancellors attempted emergency decrees, but their measures were too little too late. Each month brought new bankruptcies, new rallies, new street fights. By 1931, the Weimar Republic felt less like a government than a caretaker of chaos. The once vibrant cultural life of Berlin dimmed. Jazz clubs closed or turned grim, their music drowned out by the chants of marching paramilitaries. Intellectuals fled abroad or fell silent. The promise of the golden 20s now seemed like a cruel mirage. Yet even amid despair, some Germans still clung to democratic ideals. Trade unions organized relief efforts. Journalists exposed corruption and warned of authoritarian dangers. But their voices were often drowned out by the drumbeat of extremism. Hunger and fear rarely breed patience for slow constitutional remedies. The global economic collapse tightened its grip. World trade shrank, crippling German exports. Foreign banks refused new credit. Meanwhile, reparations from the Treaty of Versailles still loomed, a reminder of debts that Germany could scarcely acknowledge, let alone pay. Every headline, every shuttered factory reinforced the sense that the Republic was doomed. For the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, this was the moment they had awaited. They offered not compromise, but certainty, an ironclad vision of national rebirth. In beer halls and town squares, Adolf Hitler's fiery speeches promised to sweep away humiliation, restore jobs, and crush the enemies, real or imagined, who had dragged Germany low. To citizens who had lost everything, his words rang like a clarion call. By the early 1930s, the stage was set. Economic catastrophe had broken the Weimar Republic's fragile legitimacy. Millions of ordinary Germans, battered by unemployment and humiliation, were ready to gamble on any leader who vowed to bring order and pride. The Great Depression had done more than wreck Germany's economy. It had cracked the foundation of its democracy, opening the door for a radical new force that would soon seize the nation's destiny. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation staggering under the weight of despair. The familiar rhythms of everyday life, steady wages, reliable currency, a sense of national pride had disintegrated. In that vacuum, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, discovered a fertile breeding ground for its radical message. What began as a small fringe movement of disillusioned veterans and political agitators rapidly transformed into a mass phenomenon. Adolf Hitler, the party's mesmerizing orator and strategist, understood the psychology of a wounded nation. In crowded beer halls, his speeches blended fiery nationalism with theatrical flair. He portrayed Germany as a noble victim shackled by the diktat of Versailles and betrayed by corrupt politicians, Marxists, and Jews. His words ignited a raw emotion, anger, wrapped in the promise of redemption. Crowds who had once felt powerless now roared their approval, believing they had found a champion who would restore the lost glory of the fatherland. The Nazi Party's growth was no accident. They operated with calculated precision, pairing Hitler's charisma with an intricate web of propaganda and organization. Joseph Goebbels, the future Minister of Propaganda, mastered the art of message control. Posters, pamphlets, and carefully choreographed rallies saturated cities and villages with images of a strong, united Germany rising from the ashes. They used the newest technologies, radio broadcasts, and newsreels to reach millions, creating the impression of an unstoppable movement. Economic misery made their promises irresistible. The party pledged to end unemployment, revive industry, and defend traditional values. Their platform offered something for nearly everyone: disillusioned with the status quo, small shopkeepers terrified of communist revolution, farmers crushed by debt, veterans longing for respect, and young people hungry for purpose. At the same time, their venomous anti-Semitism provided a scapegoat for national suffering, blaming Jewish bankers, politicians, and intellectuals for everything from the Depression to Germany's defeat in the Great War. By 1930, these tactics bore fruit. In Reichstag elections that year, the Nazi Party leapt from a minor faction to the second largest in parliament. Brown shirt paramilitaries, the Sturmabteilung SA, patrolled the streets in their distinctive uniforms, projecting an image of order and discipline while intimidating opponents. Street battles between the SA and communist militias became a common sight in Berlin and other cities, turning politics into open warfare. The party's rapid rise alarmed established politicians, but many underestimated its staying power. Some conservatives believed the Nazis were merely a passing protest vote, a temporary outlet for public frustration. Others thought they could manipulate Hitler's popularity to their own advantage. Few recognized that this was no ordinary political movement. It was a revolutionary force determined to dismantle the very system that allowed it to compete. Despite its momentum, the party faced setbacks. In the 1932 presidential election, Hitler ran against aging war hero Paul von Hindenburg and lost. Later that year, the Nazis actually lost about 2 million votes in the Reichstag elections compared to earlier highs. Commentators whispered that the movement might have peaked, but these temporary dips only convinced Hitler to double down on strategy and spectacle. He crisscrossed the country by airplane, an innovation at the time, delivering multiple speeches a day and presenting himself as a modern, energetic leader ready to rescue Germany. Behind the fiery rhetoric lay a keen political instinct. Hitler knew that to seize power, he would need more than mass rallies. He required the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the conservative establishment, industrial magnates, military officers, and traditional elites who still held the levers of government. Many of these figures feared communism far more than they feared the Nazis. To them, Hitler's rabid anti-Bolshevism and promises of order made him a potential ally rather than a threat. Meanwhile, everyday Germans continued to suffer. By late 1932, unemployment hovered near 6 million, and the Republic's parliamentary gridlock seemed hopeless. Each failed government deepened public cynicism. Many voters no longer cared about the fine print of party platforms. They craved a decisive leader who would smash the chaos and restore dignity. The Nazi message, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire. One leader offered a stark, seductive simplicity. The stage was set for a fateful gamble by the nation's conservative power brokers. They believed they could harness Hitler's popularity while keeping him in check, using him as a figurehead to stabilize the country and suppress the left. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. On January 30th, 1933, after months of backroom negotiations and political deadlock, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. To the conservative elites, it seemed a clever compromise: give the upstart a limited role, surround him with seasoned politicians, and keep the machinery of government in their own hands. They imagined that once the Nazis confronted the realities of governance, their radicalism would fade. They could not have been more wrong. Within weeks, Hitler would exploit a single dramatic event to tighten his grip and push Germany toward an authoritarian future from which there would be no easy return. The icy winter of 1933 settled over Germany as the nation braced for yet another shift in its turbulent political landscape. On January 30th of that year, President Paul von Hindenburg, the revered but aging hero of the Great War, officially appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. To much of the conservative establishment, industrialists, aristocrats, and senior military officers, this seemed a clever, even pragmatic solution to the country's endless political deadlock. They viewed Hitler as a tool, a charismatic agitator who could rally the masses and crush the rising communist threat, but who could also be tamed once in office. Vice Chancellor Franz von Papen famously reassured nervous colleagues, "Within 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he will squeak." They believed the mechanisms of government, the president's authority, the conservative majority in the cabinet, the traditions of the state would act as a cage around the firebrand. But those who underestimated Hitler failed to grasp his relentless will and political cunning. From the moment he stepped into the chancellery, he treated the office not as a restraint, but as a launching pad. He understood that power in a parliamentary democracy could be dismantled from within if seized quickly and ruthlessly. The first critical opportunity arrived only 4 weeks later. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building in Berlin burst into flames. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene, but the circumstances of the fire remain controversial to this day. For Hitler and his allies, the blaze was a political gift. They proclaimed it the opening salvo of a vast communist conspiracy and demanded sweeping emergency powers to protect the nation. The next morning, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended key civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were effectively nullified. Police could detain suspects without trial search homes without warrants and censor publications at will. Under the guise of national security, the Nazis unleashed a wave of arrests targeting communists, socialists, and anyone deemed a political enemy. Thousands were jailed or sent to hastily established protective custody camps, precursors to the concentration camp system. With opponents cowed or silenced, Hitler pushed for even greater authority. In March 1933, the Reichstag met under intimidating conditions. SA and SS troops filled the galleries and streets to vote on the Enabling Act. This law effectively gave Hitler's cabinet the power to enact legislation without parliamentary consent, even if it violated the Constitution. Surrounded by intimidation and propaganda, most deputies, including many centrists, capitulated. Only the Social Democrats stood firm and voted against the measure. With the Enabling Act's passage, the Weimar Republic was in practice finished. From that point forward, Hitler moved methodically to eliminate all remaining checks on his power. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced with the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. Rival political parties were banned, turning Germany into a one-party state. State governments were brought under central control, stripping the Länder of their autonomy. The judiciary was reshaped to serve Nazi ideology, and civil servants were forced to swear loyalty to the Führer. The conservative elites who had believed they could contain Hitler now found themselves irrelevant. Vice-Chancellor von Papen, once confident of his ability to box Hitler in, soon realized that he and his allies had been outmaneuvered. By mid-1933, the Nazi Party held an unassailable monopoly on political power, its opponents scattered or imprisoned. Meanwhile, the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive. Joseph Goebbels orchestrated mass rallies, torchlight parades, and radio broadcasts that glorified the new regime and portrayed Hitler as Germany's savior. Newspapers printed orchestrated headlines praising the restoration of order and national pride. Children joined the Hitler Youth learning songs and chants that celebrated the fatherland and demonized outsiders. For many ordinary Germans, the sudden stability was seductive. The chaotic street battles of the Weimar years disappeared. Jobs and public works projects and rearmament programs offered hope amid the lingering depression. Yet beneath the facade of unity, a climate of fear settled over the nation. Neighbors whispered before speaking, aware that a careless word might bring the Gestapo to their door. Dissenters vanished in the night, their fates concealed behind barbed wire. The transition from democracy to dictatorship was astonishingly swift. In a matter of months, a parliamentary republic with vibrant political parties, a free press, and civil liberties had been transformed into a totalitarian state. Hitler, once a political outsider mocked by elites, now wielded near absolute authority. And he was only beginning to mold Germany to his vision. This consolidation of power did more than silence opposition. It redirected the entire machinery of the state toward a singular goal, the creation of a racially defined people's community and the preparation for expansionist war. Every ministry, every factory, every school would soon be harnessed to that purpose. The world watched with a mixture of fascination and unease. Some foreign observers marveled at the apparent revival of order and national pride. Others sensed the danger beneath the pageantry. But few could have predicted just how far and how fast Hitler's ambitions would propel Germany, or how catastrophic the consequences would be for Europe and the world. Germany's descent into dictatorship was not merely the result of one man's will. It was the culmination of years of economic trauma, political misjudgment, and societal fear. By the time many realized the true nature of the regime, it was far too late. The door to democracy had closed, and the path to militarization and war lay ominously ahead. With the Enabling Act secured and opposition parties outlawed, Hitler wasted no time transforming Germany into a fully controlled state. What had begun as a precarious chancellorship quickly hardened into a dictatorship backed by an intricate web of fear, propaganda, and violence. At the heart of this transformation stood the Gestapo, the secret state police. Initially, a small Prussian force, it expanded into a nationwide apparatus of surveillance and intimidation. Its agents wore plain clothes, blending into neighborhoods and workplaces, making it impossible for citizens to know who might be listening. A careless remark about the regime, a whispered joke in a cafe, even a private letter could lead to a midnight knock at the door. Thousands were detained without trial, and many disappeared into newly established concentration camps. Grim facilities such as Dachau, which opened in 1933 as a protective custody site for political opponents, but quickly became a model for a broader system of terror. The SA, the brown shirt paramilitary that had helped propel the Nazis to power, initially enjoyed its moment of triumph. They marched in elaborate parades and basked in the aura of victory. But their rowdy independence soon clashed with Hitler's desire for total control and the loyalty of the professional army. In June 1934, he struck decisively in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. Over the course of a few bloody days, Hitler ordered the arrest and execution of SA leaders, including Ernst Röhm and other political rivals such as former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher. The purge eliminated potential threats and won the allegiance of the German army, which applauded the suppression of the unruly brown shirts. In August 1934, when President Hindenburg died, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer leader of the German Reich and people. A plebiscite soon followed, carefully stage-managed and rife with intimidation, in which nearly 90% of voters endorsed his new role. The transformation was complete. The Weimar Republic had vanished, replaced by the Third Reich, a totalitarian state centered on the cult of a single man. Propaganda became the lifeblood of the regime. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a relentless campaign to shape perception and drown out dissent. Radio broadcasts carried Hitler's speeches into every home. Newsreels depicted endless parades, shining uniforms, and adoring crowds. Enormous rallies at Nuremberg bathed tens of thousands in a spectacle of banners and torchlight designed to make individuals feel swept up in an unstoppable national movement. Art, music, and film were harnessed to glorify the state and demonize its chosen enemies. Education followed suit. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize Aryan superiority and national destiny. Teachers were required to swear loyalty to Hitler, and the Hitler Youth became a mandatory path for children indoctrinating a new generation in obedience and militarism. For many young Germans, loyalty to the Führer became as natural as loyalty to family. The economic front provided fertile ground for further consolidation. The regime launched massive public works programs from highway construction to land reclamation projects, projecting an image of prosperity and progress. The most famous of these was the Autobahn, a network of modern highways hailed as a symbol of national pride and efficiency. Although touted as a boon for civilian travel, the Autobahn also served military aims, offering a rapid transit system for troops and equipment. Hitler himself took personal interest in the design of these roads, insisting they showcase the scenic beauty of the German countryside, while demonstrating the technical prowess of the Reich. Unemployment, which had soared during the Great Depression, appeared to plummet, but the statistics were carefully manipulated. Women were encouraged or coerced out of the workforce through marriage loans and policies glorifying motherhood, artificially reducing the number of job seekers. Part-time workers were counted as fully employed. Forced laborers, prisoners, and Jews stripped of their rights were excluded from unemployment figures entirely. The government celebrated success in ending unemployment, masked a darker reality, a workforce increasingly controlled, coerced, and mobilized for the regime's ambitions. Those ambitions were becoming clear. Rearmament began almost immediately, though at first it was cloaked in secrecy and euphemisms. Factories ostensibly producing farm equipment quietly tooled up for weapons production. Airplane designs were labeled as civilian projects, while engineers perfected fighter planes and bombers. By 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to announce mandatory military conscription, openly flouting the Treaty of Versailles and expanding the army far beyond its allowed limits. The Wehrmacht grew at a staggering pace, transforming Germany into a formidable military power in just a few years. For many ordinary Germans, these developments brought a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Streets where safer wages steadied, and the humiliations of Versailles seemed to recede. But the cost was evident to anyone who dared look closely. Dissent had been extinguished. Jewish citizens faced an escalating campaign of exclusion, beginning with professional bans and culminating in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped them of citizenship and prohibited marriage with Aryans. Surveillance was constant, and the line between public and private life blurred until it all but disappeared. Internationally, reactions varied. Some foreign journalists marveled at Germany's rapid recovery from economic disaster and its disciplined public works projects. Business leaders in Britain and the United States saw opportunities for trade and investment. Yet others sensed the menace beneath the pageantry, warning that a nation rearming at breakneck speed under a dictatorial leader posed a grave threat to European stability. By the late 1930s, the transformation of Germany was undeniable. What had once been a fragile democracy riddled with factionalism had become a unified, mobilized state bent on expansion. Every institution, from the press to the schools, from the economy to the family, had been bent toward the will of one man. The nation that only a decade earlier reeled from hyperinflation and political chaos now projected an image of iron discipline and purposeful strength. But the foundation of this apparent revival was brittle. The economic boom relied on deficit spending and the expectation of conquest to pay the bills. The social unity was built on fear repression and the exclusion of millions deemed undesirable. And the military buildup, though dazzling in its speed, pointed inexorably toward conflict. Germany's neighbors watched with increasing alarm as Hitler tested the limits of international tolerance, reoccupying the Rhineland, forging alliances with Italy and Japan, and speaking ever more boldly of reclaiming territories lost after the Great War. Each gamble that went unanswered emboldened him further. The machinery of repression, propaganda, and militarization was complete. What remained was the final step to turn this meticulously controlled society outward, unleashing the forces of war that had been gathering since the day Hitler first took power. By the mid-1930s, foreign journalists visiting Germany often marveled at what looked like a spectacular economic comeback. Unemployment, once staggering, seemed to plummet. Gleaming new roads threaded across the countryside, factory chimneys belched smoke again, and proud citizens drove shiny new cars, at least in propaganda posters. To a weary world still gripped by the Great Depression, Hitler's Germany appeared to have discovered a formula for prosperity. But behind the triumphant parades and official statistics lay a carefully constructed illusion. The Nazi regime understood that numbers could be as potent as weapons, and they manipulated them with meticulous skill. Many of the so-called new jobs were accounting tricks. Women, for example, were strongly urged to leave the workforce through marriage loans and policies that celebrated domestic life as a patriotic duty. Every woman who stepped away from paid employment was one less person counted as unemployed, without a single new job actually created. Part-time laborers were tallied as fully employed, inflating the figures further. Jews, meanwhile, were systematically expelled from civil service positions, the legal profession, journalism, and countless other fields. Their dismissals and the transfer of their businesses to Aryan owners were recorded as fresh opportunities for loyal Germans rather than as acts of persecution. Prisoners forced into backbreaking labor and men compelled into make-work projects were likewise listed as gainfully employed. The unemployment rate, trumpeted as proof of Hitler's genius, concealed the reality that millions had simply been pushed out of the ledger. The regime also used coercive voluntary programs to absorb job seekers. Borrowing from an earlier Weimar initiative, the Nazis expanded the Reich labor service, ostensibly a public works corps for patriotic youth. In practice, many of the participants were unemployed men compelled to dig ditches, clear forests, or work on farms for meager pay. Refusal meant the loss of welfare benefits, or worse. To the outside world, these workers looked like symbols of industrious renewal. In truth, they were cogs in a system that valued obedience over fair wages. Still, the government did embark on genuine building projects, highways, bridges, dams that employed hundreds of thousands. The most famous was the Autobahn, a nationwide network of modern motorways hailed as a marvel of engineering. Hitler personally shaped its routes to showcase Germany's scenic beauty and technological prowess. Foreign visitors photographed the elegant bridges and sweeping curves, and German families were told they would soon explore the fatherland in their own affordable automobile, the Volkswagen, or people's car. Yet, the Autobahn's deeper purpose was military. Hitler envisioned concrete arteries capable of moving troops and equipment swiftly across the Reich. Engineers even experimented with designs to shelter columns of tanks from air attack, though these proved impractical. Despite massive investment and breathless propaganda, ordinary Germans rarely drove these highways. Private car ownership remained a luxury, and the promised Volkswagens never materialized for the workers who faithfully paid into savings plans. Their contributions, totaling millions of Reichsmarks, were quietly diverted to armaments. Indeed, rearmament was the true engine of the Nazi economy. As early as 1934, factories that claimed to manufacture farm equipment were secretly tooling up for tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Civilian companies produced machine tools that could be swiftly adapted for weapons production. By 1935, Hitler felt bold enough to announce mandatory conscription, openly defying the Treaty of Versailles. Within a few years, the German army expanded from the treaty-limited 100,000 men to nearly 1 million, absorbing thousands of unemployed young men and pumping wages into local economies. Financing this vast expansion posed a thorny challenge. Memories of the 1923 hyperinflation still haunted the public, so simply printing money was politically dangerous. Instead, Nazi economists devised a clever but risky scheme known as MIFO bills. These were essentially promissory notes issued through a dummy corporation, allowing the government to pay armaments manufacturers with IOUs that banks treated as cash. The arrangement hid enormous deficit spending from both the public and foreign creditors, as long as confidence held the system worked. But it was a gamble that depended on future conquests to repay debts. While the numbers looked impressive, industrial output soared and the gross national product climbed, the benefits were sharply uneven. The boom favored heavy industry and armaments while consumer goods lagged. Housing shortages worsened. Everyday items from butter to shoes remained scarce or expensive. Wages rose slightly but were offset by longer hours and strict controls over unions and strikes. The German Labor Front, which replaced independent trade unions, dictated wages and conditions, ensuring that workers served the state's priorities, not their own bargaining power. For those outside the Nazi racial ideal, the so-called miracle was pure nightmare. Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups faced escalating persecution. Businesses once proudly owned by Jewish families were Aryanized, seized, or sold under duress to regime loyalists. Skilled Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, scientists were expelled from their posts, their talents erased from the economy, even as propaganda boasted of rising employment. Camps like Dachau swelled with prisoners whose only crime was opposition or identity. Yet many ordinary Germans accepted or even embraced the regime's narrative. The memory of the Great Depression and hyperinflation made any appearance of stability intoxicating. To millions, the sight of new roads, grand parades, and humming factories seemed proof that, Germany had been resurrected. Foreign observers, too, were often impressed. Business delegations from Britain and the United States toured the Autobahn and returned home marveling at Germany's efficiency, largely blind to the coercion and deceit behind the facade. By the late 1930s, Hitler's government was spending at a pace far beyond its revenues. Deficit financing ballooned, but the leadership brushed aside concerns. The regime's economic vision rested on a single perilous assumption that future military victories would yield plunder raw materials, territory, and slave labor sufficient to pay the bills. Germany's apparent prosperity was therefore not a stable achievement, but a war economy in waiting its survival contingent on expansion. The glittering surface of the Nazi economic miracle thus concealed a foundation of exploitation, manipulation, and reckless ambition. It dazzled visitors and reassured citizens, but it was never meant to serve peace. Every Autobahn mile, every factory line, every carefully massaged statistic pointed toward the same destination, a continent-wide conflict that the regime both anticipated and required. By the late 1930s, Germany's outward prosperity masked a dangerous truth. The Nazi economy was built on a house of cards. While propaganda boasted of full employment and bustling factories, the government was quietly spending far more than it earned. Taxes alone could never fund the immense rearmament programs, massive public works, and social incentives that Hitler demanded. Yet memories of the 1923 hyperinflation made printing unlimited money politically perilous. To solve this dilemma, Nazi economists, chief among them Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, devised an ingenious but risky financial tool known as Mefo bills. Issued through a dummy company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO. These were essentially promissory notes that allowed the government to pay armaments manufacturers with IOUs rather than cash. Banks accepted these notes as if they were real currency, while their true purpose and scale remained hidden from the public and foreign creditors. The system worked like a charm at first. MEFO bills gave the regime a secret credit line to fund colossal spending without sparking immediate inflation. Factories expanded, workers were hired, and the Wehrmacht rearmed at a breathtaking pace. But the arrangement was a time bomb. The bills would eventually come due, and the government had no conventional plan to repay them. Behind closed doors, Nazi leaders understood that only future conquest, with its promise of looted resources and forced labor, could fill the gap. Hitler embraced this gamble wholeheartedly. He saw economics not as a balance sheet, but as a weapon for national revival and expansion. Every mark spent on public works, propaganda, or rearmament was an investment in the war he considered inevitable. Long-term stability balanced budgets, foreign trade, consumer goods mattered little compared to building a military capable of reshaping Europe. This mindset pervaded every sector. Heavy industry thrived, churning out steel machinery and chemicals for tanks and planes. But production of consumer goods stagnated or declined. Ordinary Germans found it harder to buy clothing appliances or even certain foods. Rationing had not yet begun, but shortages and queues were common. Wages inched upward, yet rising taxes and mandatory donations to Nazi organizations often canceled out the gains. Workers were expected to labor longer hours with fewer rights, their independent unions long since replaced by the state-controlled German Labor Front. To maintain public support, the regime relied on spectacle and small perks. The Strength Through Joy program offered subsidized vacations, concerts, and leisure activities projecting an image of benevolent care for the common worker. These diversions kept morale high even as personal purchasing power lagged. Citizens who might have grumbled about tight household budgets were distracted by cheap theater tickets or the dream of an affordable Volkswagen. Though the promised people's car remained a phantom, its funds siphoned to weapons production. Foreign trade presented another challenge. Determined to free Germany from dependence on imports, the Nazis pushed for autarky or economic self-sufficiency. They sought substitutes for vital raw materials like rubber and oil, experimenting with synthetic fuels and artificial fibers. While partially successful, these efforts could never fully supply a modern industrial economy. Strategic resources such as iron or oil and grain still had to come from abroad, and Hitler's eye increasingly turned to neighboring territories rich in these essentials. The concept of Lebensraum, or living space, was not merely ideological. It was an economic necessity for a nation planning perpetual mobilization. By 1937, Schacht himself grew uneasy. He warned that runaway spending and hidden debts were unsustainable without aggressive expansion. His caution clashed with Hitler's grand designs, and soon Schacht was sidelined, replaced by Hermann Göring and his 4-year plan, which explicitly aimed to ready Germany for war within 4 years. Göring's approach was blunt: accelerate rearmament, tighten control over key industries, and intensify preparation for the conquest that would provide the raw materials Germany lacked. The 4-year plan marked a decisive shift. Synthetic fuel plants multiplied, steel and armaments production soared, and the Luftwaffe expanded at a pace that alarmed foreign observers. Rearmament consumed an ever larger share of the national budget, by some estimates more than 20% by 1938. Meanwhile, civilian sectors languished. Farmers struggled with price controls, and urban consumers faced rising costs for everyday goods. But dissent was rare. The Gestapo ensured that complaints remained whispers, not movements. Internationally, Germany's economic gamble seemed both impressive and ominous. Visitors saw modern highways, tidy factories, and enthusiastic workers, often missing the underlying strain. Diplomats and financiers debated whether the Reich's growth was sustainable or a dangerous bluff. A few astute observers guessed the truth: the Nazi boom could endure only through conquest. Hitler, for his part, made no secret of his intentions to those closest to him. In secret conferences, he spoke of the need to secure resources in Eastern Europe, to seize farmland and oil fields, and to harness millions as slave labor for the Reich. War was not a distant possibility. It was the linchpin of the economic plan. Every borrowed mark, every MIFO bill, every synthetic fuel plant was a step toward that inevitable conflict. The glittering facade of prosperity thus concealed a stark reality. Germany's economy was already a war economy. Its apparent strength rested on deception, coercion, and the expectation of plunder. When foreign creditors or cautious citizens questioned the sustainability of Nazi finances, the regime responded with bravado and spectacle, grand rallies, triumphant speeches, and carefully managed statistics that discouraged scrutiny. By the late 1930s, the trap was set. The MIFO bills would soon mature, requiring repayment the Reich could not afford. To escape financial reckoning, Hitler needed not peace, but victory, swift, decisive, and rich in spoils. In his mind, the economic and military timelines were perfectly aligned. Germany must strike before the illusion of prosperity collapsed. Thus, the nation marched toward war not merely out of ideology or vengeance, but from the cold arithmetic of a regime that had bet its survival on conquest. The so-called economic miracle was in the end a mirage, one sustained by propaganda, and destined to vanish in the firestorm it had been designed to ignite. By the late 1930s, the mask was slipping. Germany's seemingly vibrant economy revealed its true purpose: a vast engine for war. Every policy, every grand public works project, every miraculous statistic ultimately pointed toward a single goal: military domination of Europe. The most obvious signal was the massive rearmament program, beginning covertly in the early 1930s and accelerating after the 1935 four-year plan. The scale of Germany's military buildup defied the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. Officially, factories were turning out tractors, civilian aircraft, and farm machinery. In reality, they were producing tanks, fighter planes, and artillery pieces. Hidden assembly lines churned out rifles and howitzers, while engineers designed advanced weaponry under the guise of harmless research. One of Hitler's boldest steps was the reintroduction of conscription in March 1935. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany's army to 100,000 men, but with a single decree, Hitler announced the creation of a Wehrmacht of 550,000. International protests followed, but they were weak and short-lived. Emboldened, the regime pressed forward. By 1939, the German army had swelled to nearly 1 million soldiers, more than 8 times the treaty limit. For many unemployed or restless young men, conscription provided not only wages and food, but also a sense of pride and purpose, long missing from the years of humiliation. The Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, emerged almost overnight. Under the direction of Hermann Göring, it expanded into a formidable fleet of bombers and fighters, dazzling foreign observers during air shows while secretly training for offensive operations. The Kriegsmarine or Navy likewise began rebuilding, laying down submarines and battleships despite clear treaty violations. Shipyards that once produced merchant vessels now hammered steel for U-boats that would one day stalk the Atlantic. This military revival was not confined to hardware. The Nazi regime infused society with a martial spirit. School curricula glorified soldiers and conquest. The Hitler Youth drilled boys in physical fitness, marksmanship, and unquestioning obedience, grooming them for future service. Girls in the League of German Maidens were taught that their patriotic duty lay in raising strong sons for the Reich. Every parade, every radio broadcast, every stadium rally reinforced the message that war was not merely inevitable, it was noble. Behind the pageantry lay relentless economic mobilization. The government funneled billions of Reichsmarks into armaments, dwarfing civilian budgets. Synthetic fuel plants and chemical factories received priority over consumer industries. Farmers were pressured to increase output to feed a growing army. Skilled laborers were drafted into munitions plants, while foreign trade policies focused on securing raw materials for weapons rather than consumer goods. Ordinary Germans might struggle to buy butter or shoes, but the Wehrmacht never lacked for steel or ammunition. The Gestapo and SS ensured that dissent was nearly impossible. Workers who complained about long hours or shortages risked imprisonment or worse. Independent unions had long since been dissolved, replaced by the state-run German Labor Front, which dictated wages and conditions to serve the rearmament drive. Propaganda framed these sacrifices as patriotic contributions to the fatherland's glorious future. Posters depicted happy workers in gleaming factories, while radio broadcasts praised the people's community united behind the Führer. Abroad, Germany's brazen defiance of Versailles unsettled its neighbors, but responses were inconsistent and timid. In 1936, Hitler ordered troops to reoccupy the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone that served as a buffer with France. The move violated the treaty and risked immediate war if France resisted. Yet no serious challenge came. Buoyed by this success, Hitler drew the lesson that the Western democracies lacked the will to stop him. 2 years later came the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. Again, German troops faced no real opposition as they crossed the border in March 1938, greeted by cheering crowds and orchestrated plebiscites. That autumn, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, pursued a policy of appeasement, culminating in the Munich Agreement that ceded the Sudetenland to Germany without a shot fired. Each gamble paid off, strengthening both Germany's strategic position and Hitler's domestic support. The Wehrmacht gained territory and resources, while the populace reveled in a sense of restored national pride. Factories ramped up production with new mines, forests, and industrial sites now under German control. Foreign critics warned of the growing threat, but within Germany the mood was triumphant. Hitler's promises of greatness seemed vindicated. Yet this rapid expansion carried hidden dangers. Rearmament strained the economy to its limits. Despite propaganda claims of plenty, shortages of raw materials and foreign currency grew acute. MIFO bills, the financial sleight of hand that had funded early rearmament, were coming due, threatening a fiscal crisis. Hitler's economic advisors warned that without new sources of food, oil, and minerals, the Reich would face severe shortages within a few years. To sustain the military machine, Germany needed not just influence, but direct control over vast new territories. This urgency shaped foreign policy. Plans for the conquest of Lebensraum living space in Eastern Europe moved from rhetoric to strategy. Nazi planners eyed the fertile plains of Poland and Ukraine as breadbaskets and the oil fields of the Caucasus as lifelines for the mechanized army. War was no longer a distant possibility. It was a calculated necessity to feed the industrial and military appetites of the regime. Within Germany, the public mood oscillated between pride and unease. Many citizens enjoyed the sense of national revival, but whispers of rationing and price controls hinted at the costs ahead. Some families quietly stocked food or hid savings in foreign currencies, fearing that another economic storm might come. Yet open criticism remained rare. The Gestapo's watchful presence, combined with genuine enthusiasm for Germany's regained status, kept opposition muted. By 1939, the transformation was unmistakable. A country that only a decade earlier had been prostrate with unemployment and inflation now stood as a heavily armed power. Its economy and society fused into a single war machine. The Reich's leaders believed they faced a simple equation, either expand or collapse. Their solution was clear. In August of that year, Germany stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. With its eastern flank temporarily secured, Hitler was free to move against Poland. On September 1, 1939, German forces poured across the border, unleashing a blitzkrieg that would ignite the Second World War. For many Germans, the invasion seemed like the final step in a long-anticipated restoration of national power. But the triumphalism masked the grim reality: the economy that had appeared so vigorous was already overextended, dependent on plunder to sustain itself. The glittering facade of prosperity had been nothing more than preparation for a war of conquest and annihilation. Germany's rearmament was not merely a buildup of weapons. It was the remaking of an entire society to serve a single catastrophic purpose. The factories, the schools, the propaganda, even the vaunted Autobahn, all were instruments of a regime that had bet its future on domination. As Europe descended into war, the true cost of that gamble was about to be revealed on a scale the world had never before witnessed. While tanks rolled off assembly lines and new soldiers filled the barracks, the Nazi regime continued to dazzle the world with symbols of peaceful modernization. Chief among these was the Autobahn, the grand network of high-speed highways touted as a gift to every German citizen. To foreign visitors, it seemed an emblem of a nation reborn, an engineering marvel that promised prosperity and mobility. Hitler had personally championed the Autobahn soon after taking power, declaring that it would bind the Reich together like a concrete ribbon of unity. Construction began in 1933, and within a few years, thousands of kilometers of roadway stretched across the German countryside. Photographs of clean, sweeping curves and elegant bridges filled newspapers and propaganda posters. Workers in crisp uniforms appeared in newsreels, singing patriotic songs as they laid stone and poured concrete. To ordinary Germans, the project carried multiple meanings. It symbolized economic renewal at a time when memories of mass unemployment were still raw. It promised a modern future where families could drive their own affordable car across a unified and beautiful fatherland. And it served as proof, carefully orchestrated proof, that the Führer's government was a benevolent builder, not merely a destroyer. But beneath the spectacle, the Autobahn's practical purpose was far more strategic. Hitler envisioned these motorways as military arteries, enabling rapid troop movements and supply lines in wartime. Engineers even explored plans for concrete covers to shield columns of panzers from aerial attack, though these ideas proved impractical. The routes themselves were chosen with military logistics in mind, as much as scenic vistas connecting key industrial regions and potential invasion corridors. Labor for the project came from a mix of sources. Unemployed men drafted into the Reich labor service, skilled engineers inspired by patriotic fervor, and eventually foreign forced laborers. Conditions were often harsh. Workers endured long hours of heavy manual labor with minimal pay, while propaganda presented their efforts as joyful service to the nation. The regime claimed that the Autobahn created over 100,000 jobs, but economists later showed that the figure was exaggerated and that the employment impact on the overall economy was modest. The promised Volkswagen, or people's car, became another propaganda triumph. Hitler envisioned a simple, affordable automobile that every German family could own. A slick advertising campaign encouraged workers to pay into a savings plan with the dream of someday receiving their own shiny car to cruise the new highways. Hundreds of thousands enrolled dutifully, making weekly payments. Yet not a single civilian ever received a Volkswagen before the war. The fund's over 100 million Reichsmarks were diverted to weapons production, while the Volkswagen plant was repurposed to build military vehicles. The dream of leisurely Sunday drives remained a fantasy, even as the propaganda machine celebrated it as a reality. International observers often failed to see through the facade. Visiting dignitaries marveled at the sleek roads and apparent prosperity. Journalists wrote glowing reports of a Germany transformed by modern engineering. Few grasped that these showcase projects were little more than window dressing for a regime bent on conquest. Within Germany, the Autobahn became a powerful symbol of national pride. Photographers captured images of families picnicking along the routes or pausing to admire the modern bridges and roadside inns. School children learned songs about the new highways, and travel posters depicted happy motorists exploring alpine vistas. The message was clear. Under Hitler, Germany was moving fast, modern, unstoppable. Yet even as cars were scarce and civilian traffic light military convoys quietly tested the roads, truckloads of soldiers and equipment rumbled along the concrete lanes, rehearsing for the conflicts to come. The Autobahn, like so many Nazi projects, served a dual purpose, uplifting propaganda on the surface and hard strategic value underneath. The Autobahn also demonstrated the regime's skill at blending aesthetics with ideology. Hitler personally insisted that the roads harmonize with the landscape, curving gracefully through forests and valleys, rather than cutting bluntly across them. Bridges were designed with architectural flair meant to inspire awe and reflect the supposed unity of a revitalized nation. Every mile reinforced the narrative of a strong, culturally sophisticated Germany while subtly preparing for war. In truth, the economic impact of the Autobahn was limited. Railroads remained the backbone of German transportation, especially for heavy freight and troop movements. Car ownership, despite propaganda, remained a privilege of the middle and upper classes. By 1939, only a small fraction of Germans owned automobiles, and the vast majority experienced the highways only through photographs or state-sponsored tours. Nevertheless, the Autobahn succeeded brilliantly as a propaganda tool. It convinced many Germans and even foreign skeptics that the Nazi regime was not only capable of grand visions, but also of delivering tangible progress. The image of a forward-looking, technologically advanced Germany helped mask the darker realities of political repression, economic coercion, and relentless militarization. As Europe edged closer to war, these gleaming highways stood as paradoxical monuments. To the casual eye, they symbolized peace, leisure, and national pride. To the planners in Berlin, they were the veins through which the lifeblood of a future war would flow. The Autobahn was Germany's showcase to the world, but it was also a reminder that every achievement of the Third Reich, no matter how modern or beautiful, was ultimately in service of a far more destructive purpose. By the eve of the Second World War, the Third Reich projected an image of dazzling economic vigor. Industrial production had doubled since the dark days of the early 1930s. The official unemployment rate hovered near zero. Foreign journalists returned home raving about a nation that had somehow beaten the Great Depression, while much of the world still struggled. Hitler's carefully staged parades and grand architecture reinforced the illusion of unstoppable progress. But behind the banners and fanfare, Germany's apparent prosperity was brittle, a structure propped up by coercion, creative accounting, and the relentless drive toward war. The so-called full employment rested on deliberate manipulation. Women, for instance, were pushed out of paid labor through marriage loans and state propaganda that glorified motherhood as the highest patriotic calling. Every woman who left her job for the home quietly reduced the unemployment rolls without creating a single new position. Jews and other minorities were expelled from professions and businesses, their livelihoods stolen and redistributed to regime loyalists. They too vanished from the statistics. Part-time workers were counted as fully employed, while hundreds of thousands forced into labor camps or make-work projects were listed as gainfully employed despite meager wages and brutal conditions. At the same time, the government poured vast sums into armaments infrastructure and spectacle spending far beyond its actual revenue. The clever Mayfo bills, those hidden promissory notes used to pay armaments contractors, had delayed the reckoning for years, but they would soon mature. By 1939, the Reich's debt had soared and gold reserves were dangerously low. Economists inside the government knew the truth: without a constant influx of raw materials and foreign currency, the economy would seize up. Only conquest could close the gap. Consumer life reflected these tensions. Shiny propaganda images showed happy families motoring along the Autobahn or enjoying strength through joy holidays. Yet ordinary Germans often faced shortages of meat, butter, and imported goods. Clothing and household items remained expensive and sometimes scarce. Wages had risen slightly since the depths of the Depression, but price controls and compulsory donations to Nazi organizations offset much of the gain. Independent unions were banned. The state-run German labor front set wages and hours to suit the demands of rearmament rather than workers' needs. Still, many citizens accepted or even welcomed the trade-offs. Memories of 1920s hyperinflation and early 1930s unemployment lingered. For those who had suffered joblessness or hunger, the regime's ability to provide steady work. No matter how manipulated, the numbers felt like a miracle. Factories bustled the streets seemed safe, and national pride, long wounded by the Treaty of Versailles, was being restored. For millions, the improvement over the chaos of the Weimar years was undeniable, even if the cost was civil liberty and truth itself. That cost fell heaviest on those the Nazis labeled undesirable. Jewish families were systematically excluded from the economy, their shops seized, their bank accounts frozen, their very right to earn a living revoked. Roma political dissidents and people with disabilities faced similar persecution. By the late 1930s, tens of thousands were imprisoned in concentration camps where forced labor became a grim pillar of production. While propaganda trumpeted full employment, these captives worked under conditions so harsh that many never emerged alive. International observers often failed to grasp the depth of the deception. Delegations from Britain and the United States toured factories and highways, marveling at apparent efficiency. Some businessmen saw profitable partnerships and chose to overlook the regime's brutality. Only a handful of economists and diplomats recognized the warning signs: ballooning deficits, dependence on imported oil and iron ore, and the dangerous gamble that future wars of plunder would pay the bills. For Hitler and his inner circle, these economic realities were not an embarrassment, but a strategy. The Reich's economy was designed to be temporary, a springboard for expansion. Hitler spoke openly in private about the need for Lebensraum, or living space, particularly in the fertile lands of Eastern Europe. He envisioned vast territories conquered and colonized, their resources exploited, and their populations enslaved or exterminated to feed the German war machine. Every kilometer of Autobahn, every factory expansion, every carefully massaged statistic served this larger vision. The imbalance grew ever more stark. By 1938, military spending consumed more than a quarter of Germany's national income, far beyond sustainable peacetime levels. Imports of vital commodities, oil, rubber, iron ore, strained the nation's limited foreign currency reserves. Barter agreements and synthetic substitutes offered only partial relief. Without new conquests, the Reich faced the prospect of economic crisis within a few years. War was not merely a political goal, it had become an economic necessity. Yet the propaganda triumph was so complete that few Germans grasped how precarious their miracle truly was. Newspapers printed glowing reports of rising production and new jobs. Radio broadcasts celebrated each new factory and stretch of highway as proof of national strength. The average citizen enjoying steady wages and public entertainments had little reason or ability to question the official narrative. By the summer of 1939, Germany stood outwardly strong but inwardly overextended. The nation's gross national product had surged from about 60 billion Reichsmarks in 1932 to well over 100 billion. But much of that wealth existed only on paper or in weapons that could not feed a population or pay foreign creditors. Debt soared, trade deficits widened, and the Reich's survival increasingly depended on seizing resources from beyond its borders. It was a prosperity built on sand, dazzling to the eye, but doomed the moment the tide turned. Within weeks, that tide would indeed shift. When German troops invaded Poland in September 1939, launching the Second World War, they were not merely fulfilling Hitler's territorial ambitions. They were also acting out the logic of an economy that had mortgaged its future on conquest. The economic miracle that impressed so many foreign visitors and reassured so many Germans was never designed to last. It was a facade for rearmament, an elaborate illusion meant to buy time until war could deliver the spoils that would keep the machine running. Beneath the glittering surface, the Third Reich's economy was as brittle as the ideology that built it, a structure destined to collapse under the very weight of its own ambitions. By the summer of 1939, the Reich radiated an aura of unstoppable momentum. Foreign correspondents wrote of a nation that had seemingly leapt from humiliation to dominance in less than a generation. Massive parades filled Berlin's broad avenues with rows of gleaming tanks and perfectly drilled soldiers. The swastika flew over territories that only a year before had belonged to Austria and Czechoslovakia. To many observers, Germany looked not only revived, but invincible. Yet, the power on display concealed an economy already stretched to its limits and a society running on fear propaganda and borrowed time. The very successes that impressed outsiders had locked the regime into a dangerous trap. To sustain its growth, it needed conquest. The loans, hidden deficits, and creative accounting that funded rearmament could not continue indefinitely. Without new resources, oil from the Caucasus, grain from the plains of Poland and Ukraine, iron ore from the East Germany's engine would stall. Hitler understood this with cold clarity. In private meetings with his generals, he spoke of seizing Lebensraum as both destiny and necessity. Eastern Europe, with its fertile farmland and mineral wealth, would feed the Reich and provide room for a racially defined Aryan population. The people who already lived there were to be displaced, enslaved, or annihilated. War was not a last resort. It was the cornerstone of Nazi economic and racial ideology. Diplomatically, Hitler moved with calculated audacity. In August 1939, he stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The agreement ensured that Germany could strike Poland without fear of a two-front war, buying the time and resources he needed for the coming conflict. Within days, German troops were massing on Poland's border. On September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht unleashed Blitzkrieg, a lightning war of tanks, artillery, and dive bombers that overwhelmed Polish defenses. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. At first, the gamble paid off. Rapid victories in Poland, followed by conquest in Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, brought a windfall of resources. Occupied territories were plundered for food, coal, and industrial equipment. Millions of enslaved laborers were shipped to Germany to keep factories running. For a brief moment, the Reich seemed to have solved the economic conundrum it had created. But the hollow core of Hitler's economic miracle soon revealed itself. Conquest brought temporary spoils, but also escalating costs. Maintaining vast armies across Europe required ever greater expenditures of fuel, armaments, and manpower. As the war widened, Germany faced the same shortages it had tried to escape: oil, rubber, and critical metals. Synthetic substitutes and captured stockpiles could not keep pace with the demands of total war. On the home front, the sheen of prosperity dulled. Rationing became commonplace. Allied bombing raids shattered cities and disrupted production. The forced labor system, brutally efficient in the short term, bred resistance and required enormous resources to suppress. The very militarization that had once fueled economic growth now consumed it. The human cost was catastrophic. The same ideology that had pushed women from the workforce and Jews from their livelihoods now escalated into mass extermination. The Holocaust industrialized murder on an unprecedented scale was inextricably tied to the war economy. Camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka were not only centers of genocide, but also hubs of forced labor where millions were worked to death in service of a regime desperate for output. By 1943, the tide had turned. The defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa exposed the limits of Germany's war machine. Shortages of fuel and raw materials became acute. Inflation, long suppressed by terror and accounting tricks, re-emerged as the Reich printed money to pay its bills. The once vaunted Autobahn lay cracked and pitted from overuse and bombing, a symbol of promises unfulfilled. The people's car had become a distant memory. Its factories converted to military production and later reduced to rubble. For many Germans, the contrast between the glittering vision of the 1930s and the grim reality of the 1940s was stark. The jobs and stability that had seemed miraculous a decade earlier were revealed as illusions sustained by coercion, propaganda, and the spoils of aggression. As cities burned and families mourned, the truth became undeniable. The Nazi economic revival was never meant to create lasting prosperity. It had been a weapon designed to prepare a nation for war and destruction. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Industrial output was a fraction of its pre-war level. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were dead, and the economy that had once impressed the world was exposed as a facade built on oppression and reckless expansion. The very highways and factories that had symbolized modernity became silent witnesses to a nation's self-destruction. History's verdict is clear. The so-called economic miracle of Nazi Germany was neither miraculous nor sustainable. It was a carefully staged performance, its impressive statistics propped up by forced labor, creative bookkeeping, and the plunder of conquered lands. It promised prosperity but delivered only war, suffering, and ruin. The lesson endures. Economic growth divorced from justice, truth, and human rights is a fragile edifice. It may glitter for a season, but like the Reich itself, it eventually collapses under the weight of its own cruelty and deception.